Well, that wasn't so hard.
Aha!
Oh no!
Hey everyone, how's it going? As of late, I've once again been going through my Sonic Marathon, going through the first game, all the way up to CD, and finally I've broken into the 3D realm of games, as well as some other spin-off titles in between. For starters, I've begun my playthrough of Sonic Adventure, playing the original one, mind you, not the DX version, and simultaneously I've also started up Sonic Advance. Now, in the meantime, in between those two games, I've also decided to look at my backlog of Steam games, the ones that have been sent to me by other developers. Since I've been content creating on YouTube, I've had people reach out to me, sending me copies of their game, early access privileges and whatnot, and I look at their game and see whether it clicks with me or not, and usually I will respond along the lines of, hey, how's it going? I've checked out your game, it looks pretty interesting, I'll give it a try and see if it clicks. And then from there, I try out the game, think about what I like and dislike, and eventually when I get around to it, I will do a video on it. But unfortunately, not every game is going to interest me, so sometimes I'll get stuff sent to me that I may never come across, and it's not because I think the game is bad necessarily, but because it might not pique my interest at that present time, and in saying that, I will allow some room to revisit said game later, especially in a stage where it may be developed further. One such game that I'm going to look at is an old school boomer shooter like FPS game called Satan, made by Game Fruit Entertainment and also published by Dossman Games. Those that don't know about Dossman Games, they are a group of people that publish a set of bite-sized indie FPS games where a lot of them use an engine that I myself have used in the past called Easy FPS Editor. And what is Easy FPS Editor? Basically, it's an engine that is made for those that want a more accessible and friendly approach to developing a retro-inspired FPS game, regardless of your background, whether you code or not. Those that have never coded or written a line of code before will not have to fret, because this engine comes with its own FPS controller, its own navigation, its own UI, utilities, and even its own map editor that you can use to place entities and assets and objects, textures, weapons, what have you. It's all arranged in a manner where you can create your own Wolfenstein or old school Doom inspired FPS. It's a great engine. I've covered it on a surface level before, but there are other YouTubers who have gone into a lot more detail than I have. And it's been a while since I've touched the engine myself, but playing this game and seeing other works made by other people that have started using this engine, I have considered possibly revisiting the engine myself and maybe making another game out of it. Maybe something a lot more ambitious or something to this level, which I have recently just experienced. And I've got to say that from my experience of trying out other Easy FPS Editor games, for me this was one of the more impressive ones from a visual standpoint. Those that have used the Easy FPS Editor engine will know of its limitations, and while you can squeeze a lot out of it and even incorporate 3D models, it's still limited by design and also uses old file formats that aren't really used anymore. However, in this case, Satan FPS is one of those games where the developer did the very best that they could to bring out as much out of the engine as possible, where you still had a nice, well-made, quality bite-sized FPS within the confines of an engine that is still relatively new, has been around for a while, and is getting more attention than it did before, where a lot of people didn't know about it. And I recently played through this from beginning to end, and I found myself, for the most part, having a good time, and in some parts of it, not so much. So let's get into this a little bit, shall we? The story of this game, you play as a woman with a cross on her forehead. Not the inverted one like Glenn Benton from Deicide, but the one where you approach this game with a more religious approach, quite literally on your forehead, killing all sorts of demonic monstrosities, including bosses that represent the demonic forces of hell, with some of the aforementioned names like Azazel and Baphomet, and of course, Satan himself. Through Wolfenstein and Doom fashion, you're going to be booming and shooting your way through the labyrinths of, Earth and hell intertwined in 90s, mostly 90s, boomer shooter fashion. Like the kind of games you would play back then when you had games with stories that were sort of just like on a very small plate where it was just enough to explain what was going on, but at the same time, not like a gigantic book, not like Baldur's Gate 3 levels. Back then, story was not really that important. You just had more so background context to explain what was going on, what you were doing, and why. And in this game's case, the background story is that people that you loved, people you're close to, your family, were murdered by the demonic forces of hell, and as a result, you now go on this crusade against the forces of hell and basically get your revenge. And along the way, you get an assortment of weapons, you get an assortment of keys to get you out of the place, going from level to level, killing enemies, just like in Wolfenstein and Doom, finding said keys to get to a door that gets to another door that leads you to an exit, and then you rinse and repeat that until you reach the final area. So along the way, I didn't have too much of a challenge for the most part. The bigger challenge, honestly, was more so from the recoil. And recoil is something I'm very finicky about. It depends on the type of shooter that I'm getting into. And in this game's case, I found it to be more of an annoyance rather than something that adds more depth to the gunplay. So yeah, because I'm playing a game like this, where it's more retro inspired, I just want to be more mindless. I don't want to think too much about how to handle the weapon per se. Just point and shoot at the enemies just like I would in Wolfenstein and Doom. Just a mindless rampage against these creatures that come in different directions with very fast projectiles that, with some of them in particular, do an insane amount of damage. Most of the times where I would get hit a lot, it would just be due to not paying attention, or the projectiles just aiming at me a lot faster than I anticipated, and aiming as in going really fucking fast. All of a sudden, most of my armor would be gone, including my health too. Now, challenge aside, that sort of challenge is one of those things where you just learn through trial and error, and you identify said patterns with a lot of the enemies. You have cultists that look like the ones from Blood. You have these gigantic head-like creatures that shoot fireballs. You have these other dudes that throw blue balls at you that turn into holy water when you pick them up, which is actually a pretty useful weapon, and it was the closest thing I had in this playthrough to having a rocket launcher, which apparently is in the game too, but in my first playthrough, I never found it. Also, there is another crucifix that also shoots, I think, crosses at other enemies. But once again, I never found it. Instead, I was stuck with the pistol, the machine gun, supposedly a heavy machine gun, shotgun, holy water, and a crucifix. And those were the weapons I had from beginning to end. Now, in saying that though, I'm assuming that the crucifix and the rocket launcher were probably more so weapons that you would go out of your way to find by thoroughly exploring the level like you would, say, in Wolfenstein and Doom, where, you know, through a lot of effort and navigation, you would find secret areas like you would in those games, and you would be rewarded with, you know, upgrades and weapons that you normally would not find when you're just doing a casual playthrough, which in retrospect, I was doing in this game. Now, on a revisit, if I decide to go through a second playthrough, I could then explore the levels much more thoroughly. Now that I've experienced most of the game's content from beginning to end, I can see what else is there, but at this juncture, I'm pretty content with my current playthrough, and there are other people who have also done playthroughs of the game that have shown a lot more than I have. So this is going to be more of my personal account and how I feel about it. So what are the things that I like about Satan FPS? Okay, for starters, I really like the aesthetic behind this game. It's like if someone one day decided to do a deicide marathon, listening from one album to the next, and then suddenly remembered, hey, I could make a retro FPS game using this engine that I found, and I don't have to code. I can just make some sprites, do some animations, get some people to help with other things, cobble up some maps, and cobble up a story, or at least a background one, and then just release this game into the wild. Oh, and also add in, you know, a blood-like setting while you're at it too. And it's reflected too in the more old school-like setting, you know, also reflected by the weapons that you have. I mean, you literally have a Tommy gun, you have enemies that look like the cultists. It's very much like Blood. It's like a mix of Doom and Blood when I think about it. Like, it sort of has the aesthetics of Blood and the gameplay of Doom. I like to think of it as a combination of both, but in a bite-sized format, and I think it's really cool. The aesthetic, the atmosphere is on point in this regard, and I think in a more advanced engine like, say, Godot or even Unity, I think the idea is explored in this game in particular could be expanded even further. And the thing I like about some of these bite-sized games too is how you can tell there's always potential for something even bigger, even if it was never intended to be massive from the very start. It's one of those sort of things where it invites a lot of room to exploration of the idea established, where you could think, okay, what if we had this game's ideas, but with much more verticality going on, much more advanced geometry, high fidelity in graphics, more detailed models, more detailed weapons, more dynamic gameplay, things like that. However, this game though just keeps things simple in its current state. It keeps things back in the 90s, as if we didn't really have 3D yet. We just had a lot of these 2.5D or just Doom clone games that were coming out of the woodwork, or something along the lines of the build engine. But in this engine's case that this game is based on, it's more along the lines of Wolfenstein and Doom. And if you're really into those two games, I think you will really like this. So what else is there? Graphically, in terms of the sprite work anyways, I think they look really good. I liked a lot of the models. The bosses in particular had some really impressive sprite work going on. Animations were a little bit janky, especially with the weapons, but I think the models themselves had quite a decent amount of detail into them as well. And I really like these kind of sprites because there is an excruciating amount of detail that is compressed into this sprite format, kind of like what you see in Sulaco or in another project like Lit Doom, where you have these very, very detailed models that were made, more than likely made in something like Blender and then rendered into, you know, PNG sprites. And then you have an assembly of sprites making animations. And what you have is some pretty smooth and seamless sprite animations with some nice, you know, artwork going on for it. This game has the artwork side, I think, pretty well done. But I think the animations, I think, would use a little more frames just to have more smooth transitions between reloading or, you know, just loading up the weapons and stuff. Like say with the shotgun, even do like a quick reload animation with some shells that you pump into it. Just a quick fast one like you see in Blood or even in Doom. That's just me personally. That's something I probably would do just to add a little bit more life to the weapons. But as a starting point or as like a foundational start in the exploration of the easy FPS editor, I think the developer has done a great job with making this really nice, dark and gritty kind of retro-inspired shooter in a bite-sized format. And usually when I talk about bite-sized experiences, I also refer to the length at hand. Games like this are made to be short, can be beaten in one sitting if you have a chunk of time throughout the day. But fret not, if you are really, really stitchy on time, you do have a save and a quick save if you just want to quickly save your progress and then come back to it later. You definitely can take your time with this game, but once you get to the end and then you finish it, the only real incentive to return to it is to explore more of the secrets, finding the upgrades, finding the relics, finding the priests that can give you blessings, or finding other quests that supposedly give you upgrades, although I never really found said upgrades for the weapons, and even when I did obtain a upgrade of sorts, I never really recognized that I had it other than just hearing a sound cue, and the weapons in general seem to function just the same as how I used them in the beginning. Some of the weapons in particular, like the pistol, I found to be useful a lot of the times, especially against most of the grunts, where I could just shoot a few rounds towards the head and then they would be gone. Same as with the smaller enemies, and a lot of the other times when there were bigger crowds, I could use the holy grenade or holy water or whatever, and also the machine gun just for some more crowd control. Although if I had the other two weapons, like the crucifix that you can get that shoots magic crosses and the rocket launcher, I think, I probably would have had an easier time in some of the more hectic areas that the game throws at you later. Like there are some bosses later on in the game that have these large gigantic arenas that are showered with enemies with really fast projectiles and high damage output. As in, when you get hit by it, you get royally fucked. And when you get hit by multiple projectiles, you will die really fast. As far as I remember, I don't think these sort of games on this engine in particular has a difficulty mode, so it's kind of just a matter of playing around with numbers if you ever use this engine in the future, figuring out how much damage an enemy should do. And in the case of some enemies, like if I remember correctly, the motorcycle and as well as the final boss, they have an attack that one-shots you. And I absolutely hate one-shot attacks. I always find it a very cheap and arbitrary way to increase the difficulty of a fight. I would much rather have a boss with more complex mechanics and easy punishes towards the player making mistakes than rather just having one projectile the moment you touch it, you die, and that's it. Like, that for me is just bullshit. But that's just my personal opinion. Some people can, some people do like that sort of stuff, but I personally don't. And I'm not a big fan of the final boss fight either. It's just a matter of platforming skills while being attacked everywhere by enemies with very fast projectiles, all the while trying to dodge the final boss's projectile that kills you in one hit. Yeah, for me, that just became more annoying than fun. By the end, I was kind of just checked out on the experience, and while I am open to the idea of revisiting this, games like this I usually play once and never again. However, in saying that, this is a game that I do, for the most part, like for what it does. It has some things that I really do like about it, like what I've already mentioned with the art and the atmosphere and the sprite work done. And also, the weapons feel pretty good to use, even though the animations are a bit limited. Also, the music isn't too bad either. It's got a mix of blood-inspired music in some of the areas. And then when things get more intense, you have more metal tracks going on. But some of the tracks do get used a bit too much, and there was this drony ambient music that just kept looping over and over again, and it was actually driving me more insane than the cultists themselves. I would have liked to have maybe more of a mix-up in the music department, but for what you do have in the selection, I think it's pretty good on, small bursts of listens. Also, for those that don't like the recoil aspect of the game, you do have the option to turn it off. It does make the game somewhat easier because you don't have the constant jittering of the recoil, but on the other hand, it makes the animations of the weapons or the feel of them less impactful, so I'm guessing that's why the recoil had such an emphasis on, the sprites and how they animated during the gameplay. In saying that though, it is somewhat manageable. Some weapons handle the recoil poorly and some are just fine, like with the Tommy gun, where it's somewhat manageable, but then with the heavy machine gun, you're constantly fighting against the recoil if you're going full auto. And, it's mainly effective up close than it is from a distance. Satan FPS at the end of the day is a pretty solid bite-sized boomer shooter game, made in an engine that is quite friendly and accessible to those that want to get into making their own FPS game, but don't want to deal with all of the technical headaches that can come with, say, other more sophisticated engines. It has some quirks, and it does have some things that do piss me off at times, but it's in such a short amount of time where even if it got to a point where I just stopped, I know for a fact that I could return to it later and then just finish the game off because it doesn't take up too much of your time. It comes in, does its thing, gets straight to the point, no fluff, no BS. From beginning to end, you just boom and shoot your way through enemies, collect the keys, go to the next level, and that's it. And that's what a lot of these 90s FPS games before Half-Life and before System Shock and all that were about, where it was just like, just give me a gun. I just want to kill things. I don't care about the story, just give me a gun. And that's what this game is sort of like. And as I was saying before, it does have that background story, but it's not super important. Even if you forget about it, it doesn't really matter. And yeah, there is also an angel in the game, and spoilers coming up. He does offer you a choice of whether you want to ascend the throne, because it turns out that you're actually the daughter of Satan, or the good ending, where you can just leave hell and then decide to make the world a better place, whatever that ends up being. By the end though, I just didn't give a shit. I just wanted to get out of hell, get out of that platforming lava hell BS that I dealt with the final boss, and then just close the game and then recommend the game to you guys. Satan FPS is good for what it is. If you expect anything more out of it, you're going to be disappointed. However, I do look forward to seeing what else this developer has under the belt. And I do also look forward to seeing future easy FPS titles. There are some other games that I've also checked out from DOSman games that have also been really good, like Reverend in particular, which was also sent to me a while ago, and I played through that and I also enjoyed that game. It's somewhat similar to this, but has more cosmic horror elements to it as well, on top of the religious occultism aspects. I'm also looking forward to another title that is coming out called Dead Trash, also published by DOSman Games. Once again, we're seeing a lot of really well-made, quality-looking, bite-sized shooter games that seem to try and experiment further with the engine and seem to push boundaries with it. And that's very hard to do with an engine that's limited by design. It's kind of like with GZ Doom, where no matter how much you push the limits, there is eventually an end point where there's not much more you can do until you modify what's in the engine further. In saying that though, I'm definitely excited for the future of this engine. I'm excited for the future of seeing what else Dustman Games has underneath the table beyond Dead Trash. So that's all for my take on Satan FPS and how I felt about this game. I know I didn't get everything out of the belt, but it's one of those titles where, you know, you don't want to show every single little nook and cranny. So like, I'm not going to do a full-on essay from beginning to end covering every single little thing, just enough where you can sort of see what's going on with the game. And hopefully I've done enough to convince you to try this game out. If you go on Steam or on itch.io, you can find it for really cheap. On my page, on the Steam page, you can find it for $4.05 currently. Get it now while you still can, while the discount is still there. But even if you miss out, it's still very cheap, and it's definitely worth your time if you're in the market for a retro-inspired, bite-sized FPS game. That's all for now, folks. Thanks for watching.